The written history of Ethiopia tells us of a couple men who ventured into South Arabia. But this written history is not exactly what you would think it would be if you actually look deep into it. So, what am I talking about? Well, one of the earliest people that I mentioned, and I noticed other people start mentioning it, is Abraha. Abraha is one of the earliest people, and they're mentioned in Islamic texts, to communicate with the South Arabians. But he is not the first. He's not even the first to be written down about. In fact, there's a couple who are written down about, like the king Gadarat. Gadarat, being one of the earliest in 200 AD, was actually one of the earliest people who we have inscriptions from both Ethiopia and in South Arabia where it depicts him in communication with the kings of Saba. This again draws another similarity between these two nations, which a lot of people do not know about or even care about, but they should, because this tells a different story again about the history of these two places and how they were enemies and friends at different locations of time rather than slave and master or taker and giver or colonized and colony. And so Gadarat himself is someone that's very, very interesting in the writings. The ancient city of Marib that actually made a deal with Gadarat is one of those civilizations where we can use countering, we can use balancing to see if they were actually more powerful or less powerful than the people themselves. And the fact that they came to a steady deal, a deal where they decided that they should not kill each other for any reason, cause, or anything, tells us that these people actually knew that they were challenging someone of equal power. Gadarat was no pushover, and they knew it in Saba. The messengers that actually went from Saba all the way to the areas, the Bedouin areas, the Saudi Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, but South Arabia, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, those regions, he himself realized that after a few battles that there is no point of going further and doing these things of battling and everything. So this is how we get to this deal area. But remember, that was just the start of the relations between these two places as a kingdom. There was already relations going before this. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I telling you this now? Well, firstly, every time I show you something, I always like to show contradicting evidence. So I show you the Muslim connection with the people in Arabia and in Europe, and so I want to contrast that by showing you a connection between Christian and pre-Islamic era, and then also Islamic eras as well. So, in other words, two Jewish nations communicating with each other, two a Christian and a Jewish nation communicating with each other from Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia, and even there's some saints from Ethiopia in Europe that are Christians. So that it doesn't contradict it, but it's like it throws it up there as an idea, showing that it had nothing to do with just Muslim. These places are very close to each other. These places are right next to each other. There's no way they're not going to make deals with each other. There's no way they're not going to get into contact with each other. We see this playing out today. It played out back in the day. It keeps continuing to play out. Ethiopia is one of those places where I literally still have to make a giant video on it because the kings have, and I don't want to do that thing that I speed run every single king, because I feel like that's a waste of video when I just go this king and this king and this king and this. I feel like I should mention them one by one because they all deserve their own story. Speaking of going one by one, let's go back, way, way back before kings, when we looked at gods. So the statue you're looking at now is Almaka, and Almaka is a moon god. a sun god, and he was praised in several areas, but the two that we need to mention right now, which are very close to each other, is the Ethiopian areas and the Sabaean areas. This is pre-Christian belief, meaning that they shared this opinion even prior to this world religion of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and any of those. So it says inscriptions from the Eha and Aksum. In fact, we know from the Sabaean inscription in South Arabia that the god Al-Makka had temples in Marib, Serwa, and other places. Now, I've just mentioned Marib, and that's the one where Gadarat was taking some of his negotiations, and was honored in a temple called Ara, and on two bronze tables from Amran. He is named Lord of Ava, the castle of Alu. Two women in the neighborhood of Mariab dedicated a statue to Almaka, the lord of Ava. Also, upon an inscription in Serwa, the lord of Ava is mentioned. Therefore, it seems to me that we may safely recognize in our fragments an Almaka temple, which gave its name to the place. It to be decided whether I leave it to be decided whether these inscriptions relate to the Sabaean temple erected on Abyssinian ground or whether they relate to another temple of a similar name elsewhere. But how far did the relations actually go between Gadarat and the so called Middle Eastern related peoples? Well, quite far, because if we look at the Hadramat kingdom, we can tell that it's pretty far away from that region. But it was in alliance at this time, which a lot of people assume is the first time that these two kingdoms even contact each other. But they were in alliance with each other. They actually came up with a deal, which is written down, which says if any of their kingdoms get attacked, they will act as a unit, a coalition of sorts. If we look at the size of Saba, we can tell why they actually bow down to the Ethiopians. The keyword bow down, because some, especially those in Arabia, historians believe that actually what happened was Ethiopia at this time colonized the Sabaeans. But, other historians say no, this was more of an agreement, and that this interpretation is based off of some very small evidence. Anyway, we do know that they were in direct relation with themselves, and like I said, there is some written evidence of this. It's called the Adi Galamo inscription. If you look it up, and I'm not going to try to read it because, firstly, it's not fully written in English where I found it, but it's there for us to translate and see for ourselves, which I will do in a later date. But I want us to also picture something else in our head, which is the written language of that area. Remember, Ethiopia's written language, even though it comes ultimately from Egypt, moved a little from South Arabia in 500 BC, which tells you how long ago the connection was between South Arabia and the Ethiopian areas. There is no fear in the heart of those who seek truth. And so, let's look at it. Ethiopia, South Arabia, communication between the two. Both of them write of Arab tribes that live where? Beyond the Sabaeans. They live somewhere deep in the Sabaean areas, the Bedouin areas, and they march on these people as a group. So, in other words, the Ethiopians and the Sabaeans and the Hadramites, they all have a common enemy, but those common enemies aren't necessarily that powerful. and they are the Arab groups, which are above these regions, above South Arabia. These Arabs, of course, would ultimately win in the long run, given that most people in their world today, speak the Arabic language. Now, don't get me wrong, Ethiopia is still truly an African civilization in all ways. Remember, I've already shown you patterns and pictures and everything that depict that even deep in their Christian era, they still stuck to their African roots. Looking into things that, and I've noticed this about Africa in general. If you look at Islam in Africa, the way that it was practiced was very African. Like they didn't follow everything that Islam brought to Africa. And if you look at Ethiopia, in Christianity, a lot of the things that they did would be considered heathenism, but Ethiopia continued to do it. Spells and curses and etching the body, putting all kinds of symbols on clothing, basically idol worship. And that's what I love about Africa, that they never fully throw away everything. Even if you look at the Coptic religion, the Coptic version of Christianity, they still sort of preserve the ancient Egyptian elements about it. Because, and I think actually a lot of places in the world do this, but you have to be familiar with the original religion in order for you to know that this is happening. But in Africa, they did do this in Ethiopia, where even though King Azana converted to Christianity, that changed nothing in the sense that people who are still alive at his time would create books with proper African spells, and even the interpretation of these spells are not small. We're talking about them talking about symbols as if the symbol itself is alive. I want to say that again, as if the symbol itself is alive. This is the deepest form of idol worship. But speaking of King Azana, we look into his inscription, he's stele, he's rock with multiple inscription, multiple writing, and it's written in what? Sabaean language, in Sabaean script. So again, as early as this is, it shows us this connection between these two places. And so Abraha, I use as an example because he is one of the most written about. I mean, there's people even before him. There's all kinds of people who are written about in Islamic texts that are not kings, but are from Ethiopia. So, like I said, and they're Christian, by the way, not Muslim. So, like I said, these people, these writings, these formations, they give us a huge clue about the connection. And Gadarat, God thank Gadarat, because God, without Gadarat, we wouldn't know of the specific leaders. Now, I would mention the Arab leaders and whatever, the Sabaean leader. I've got their names and everything, but I don't think it's important for this video right now. So, let's try to get an hour video later where I go through each of the relations, because of course, like I said, there would be later Ethiopian kings who would be idolized not only in Africa but also in all over the world. But I also want to refer back to the Bible when I show you that one verse about a priest that went to Israel to worship. Remember the priest that I talked about that went to Israel to worship. This, again, tells you of a very, very early communication between the Arabian areas and Ethiopia. Now, maybe we could say that that encounter is not real, but I actually believe that it happened. And I think more than worrying about if that exact thing happened, it was more a talk about Ethiopians being open to traveling there or being allowed to travel there. I think that's more what the we should learn from that, and the fact that we do know from ancient Egyptian texts that there were Ethiopians in Arabia, and Greek texts and all these other people, and these Ethiopians were belonging to African mythology, Christianity, and Islam. It's not all about Islam. I know some people might think that I'm just peddling Islamic Ethiopians. I'm not. I'm telling you that any era you pick in history, you will find Ethiopians traveling far and wide, which is why it puzzles me when they find DNA outside of Africa, how they try to place it in one specific time, one specific locale, one specific anything, when we know that it 1,000 years it expands throughout the world. It's even shocking because, again, I mentioned all kinds of people who even went to Japan,